Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper and today I want to tell you the story of this painting by Ilya Repin. It is actually a very big painting, over 3.5 meters wide, made between 1880 and 1891, so 11 years in the making, according to the dates placed that Ilya Repin wrote on the painting itself. So he probably was kind of proud of the fact that it took him 11 years. So it most likely refers not to him working slowly, but to his very thorough research. And this painting goes by the quite long name of The Reply of the Zaporozhian Hosts of the Cossacks to the Demands of Sultan Mehmed IV of the Ottoman Empire. But before I get started with the painting itself, let me tell you something about Ilya Repin. I expect you know something about the man. I mean, you clicked on this video, but just in case. He was actually born in Ukraine, where all of this takes place. His father was a retired soldier and what's called a military settler. So during the 19th century, the Russian Empire had Russians settle in areas that were on the sort of edges of the Russian Empire, newly acquired territories and that sort of thing. Well, in Ukraine, that happened as well, and his father at some point retired from the army and became a horse trader, and they actually did quite well. They were a fairly rich family. Ilya became a painter. He was trained first in Ukraine, later in St. Petersburg, and he lived in St. Petersburg and in Moscow at times. And I guess you could say he was the most successful Russian painter of his generation. And that meant that he entered many of his paintings in the salons of Europe, and he traveled there as well. So he spent a lot of time traveling, actually. Now, back to the painting. It tells the story of an incident that might have happened in 1676. It is a legend. It's not historical fact. And as the title suggests, it's about an exchange of letters between the Zaporozhian Cossacks and Sultan Mehmed IV. The original letters, however, they are lost. We don't have them anymore, and so that is why this is a legend, because the earliest example of these letters is a so-called copy written in the 18th century, which is a century after these events supposedly took place. And these letters were discovered about 1880, so another century had passed. And they were acquired by Dmitro Zaporozhian. I'm sure that's not how it's really pronounced, but this is how it's spelled, at least in Latin letters. Now, Dmitro was a friend of Ilya Repin, and he read these letters to him, and it inspired Repin to paint this picture. To do so, he actually traveled all the way back to Ukraine, to the area where these particular Cossacks had lived, and he started portraying people from there, descendants of these Cossacks, and the painting is built up of these portraits. Now, one of the reasons he did that is because stories about Cossacks were extremely popular at the time. And that has a lot to do with, well, nationalism. Nationalism is a 19th century invention, and every country in the world was developing it. And Russians did so as well as everybody else. Now, the Russian Empire saw the Cossacks as part of their heroic ancestry, and so it fueled their own national mythology. But Ukraine had its own local form of nationalism, and there was even a movement that would strive for independence at the time. So it's not immediately clear to which of these two forms of nationalism that seem to clash, to which one of these does this painting cater? And you have to imagine that the stories of Cossacks were very popular in the 19th century. They were seen as this sort of romantic people that rode on the steppes of Ukraine, and they loved their freedom, and they were independent, and of course very, very brave, fierce fighters. And many of these stories were embellished, were made bigger, were expanded by Nikolai Gogol, one of the famous writers of the earlier 19th century. Gogol was actually from Ukraine, so he's part of that sort of double nationalism. And amongst the claims that he made of the Cossacks was that they loved more than anybody else the ideas of freedom, equality, and fraternity. And it's not exactly an accident that that is also the battle cry of the French Revolution. And it was also widely claimed in the 19th century that the Cossacks were ruled through democracy, that they did not have hereditary leaders, that they elected their leaders. Which, by the way, is not true. They did have hereditary leaders, but elected certain officials. But that's not what people believed in the 19th century. In the 19th century, they were seen as completely democratic societies. Now, those ideas of them loving freedom, equality, and fraternity and being democracies is, of course, very much at odds with the idea of the Tsar. The Russian Empire was a centrally ruled monarchy, and I doubt that Alexander III shared any of these ideas with the Cossacks. On the other hand, these Cossacks were also part of Russian history by that time. Because historically, these Cossacks, they only appear in the 16th century in history. And they lived in Ukraine and were a free society up until somewhere in the 18th century. They were organized in a semi-military style. They rode on horseback. They did travel on the steppes of Ukraine, on the wide open spaces there. And the various groups were known as hosts. And these hosts were usually named after their central fortress, their keep, you might say. In this case, they're called the Zaporozhian host. And Zaporozhian apparently means above the rapids, and that refers to the Dnieper River. And the year that this incident took place, 1676, is also the year of the start of the Russo-Turkish wars. In those wars, the Ottomans moved further into Ukraine, and the Cossacks eventually allied themselves to the Russians and helped stop their expansion. And many historians see that as a start of the course that the Cossacks went on to be absorbed eventually into the Russian Empire, or Tsarist rule. So what exactly do we see here? Well, there's a group of Cossacks and they're composing a letter. As I said before, Rapin had moved back to Ukraine and had started to portray descendants of Cossacks. So he tried to make it as historically accurate as possible. And he tried to incorporate historical costumes and weaponry to make it as authentic as he possibly could. Now, in the center of the whole group, there's this amused scribe. And he's sitting at a table trying to write his letter. And others are standing around. Some are roaring with laughter. Others look amused as well. And according to the story, what they're doing is they're writing a reply to a letter from Sultan Mehmed IV. He had sent them an ultimatum. Somewhere before this happened, the Cossacks had fought with elements of the Ottoman army, and they'd defeated them. But regardless of that defeat, the Sultan then demanded that they would surrender, which was actually not an unreasonable thing of him to do, by the way. His army at the time was seen as absolutely unstoppable, and would remain pretty much unstoppable for the next 7 years. Their first really big major defeat came in 1683 in the siege of Vienna. And that turned out the furthest point of their expansion. After that, they were gradually pushed back. But it took all the forces of Europe to do so, including Russia. And one of the tactics that the Sultan used was simply to demand surrender. It's much more peaceful than killing everybody. And pretty much the letter he would send would be a threat. It's surrender or we'll kill everybody. So to accept it would avoid a lot of bloodshed, really. But of course, this painting shows us that the Cossacks refused. And they wrote the most insulting reply they could possibly think of. And what you see in the painting is they're trying to come up with more and more elaborate insults. So, now let me read to you this exchange of letters. The version, of course in an English translation, but the version that was found in the 1880s and that inspired this painting. First, the letter written by the Sultan. And that says, Sultan Mehmed IV to the Zaporozhian Cossacks. As the Sultan, the son of Muhammad, brother of the sun and moon, grandson and viceroy of God, ruler of the kingdoms of Macedonia, Babylon, Jerusalem, Upper and Lower Egypt, emperor of emperors, sovereign of sovereigns, extraordinary knight, never defeated, steadfast guardian of the tomb of Jesus Christ, trustee chosen by God himself, the hope and comfort of Muslims, confounder and great defender of Christians, I command you, the Zaporozhian Cossacks, to submit to me voluntarily and without any resistance, and to desist from troubling me with your attacks. Turkish Sultan Mehmed IV. So basically it's a list of his titles, and then comes the reply, which mocks all these titles. And I'm going to try and read it to you in the hope that I don't immediately violate all the terms and conditions of YouTube. So, the reply is: Zaporozhian Cossacks to the Turkish Sultan. O Sultan, Turkish devil and damned devil's kith and kin, secretary to Lucifer himself, what the devil kind of knight art thou? Thou canst not slay a hedgehog with your naked arse. The devil shits and your army eats. Thou shalt not, thou son of a whore, make subjects of Christian sons. We have no fear of your army. By land and by sea we will battle thee. Fuck thy mother. Thou Babylonian scullion, Macedonian wheelwright, brewer of Jerusalem, goat-fucker of Alexandria, swineherd of Greater and Lesser Egypt, pig of Armenia, Podolian thief, catamite of Tartary, hangman of the camionets, and fool of all the world and underworld, an idiot before God, grandson of the serpent, and the crick in our dick. Pig's snout, mare's arse, slaughterhouse cur, unchristened brow, screw thine own mother. So does Zaporozhian declare, you lowlife, you won't even be herding pigs for the Christians. Now we'll conclude, for we don't know the date and don't know a calendar. The moon's in the sky, the year's with the Lord. The day's the same over here as it is over there. For this, kiss our arse. Koshovi Ottoman, Ivan Sirko, with the whole Zaporozhian host. Now, as I said before, we have no idea if this is based on any historical event, really. It could very well be that the letter, the 18th century version, was completely made up at the time. What we do know is that a series of battles was fought by the Cossacks and the Ottomans with a lot of help of their Russian allies. So it's part of both their heroic histories. Now, the painting was a huge success. It was first exhibited in 1891 in St. Petersburg, and it was subsequently bought by the Tsar, Alexander III, who paid apparently 35,000 rubles. Now, I don't know how much 35,000 rubles was at the time, but apparently it was a lot of money because it was the highest sum ever paid for a Russian painting. It was then displayed in the State Russian Museum in St. Petersburg, where it still is today. And you can see it there. That's a different museum from the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And if you're ever in the city, you should really try and visit that one as well. But before you go there, please don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. There's a little bell icon that appears when you subscribe. And if you click that one too, you actually get notified anytime I post a new video. So a win-win situation, I would say. In any case, I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and until next time.